Good evening. This is lecture 10 for Western Civ 2. We'll be looking at America today in the late 40s and the 1950s. Now, at the end of every major war, and this you can take pretty much for granted, there is always an economic recession. Virtually always, at least virtually always. The reasons for it are pretty clear. During a war, the government spends a great deal of money. They buy weapons. They employ huge numbers of people in the armed services and in manufacturing weapons and the like. So there is always full employment during a major war and massive government spending. This stimulates an economy fantastically. But part of the reason there's full employment is that large numbers of males in those days, now both men and women, I suppose, if we had another major war, God forbid, but men in the World War II, the Second World War, we had well over 1 million men in arms in World War II. That means they weren't taking jobs in the private sector, so pretty much every man who wanted a job in the private sector and wasn't in the military got a job, and hundreds of thousands of women, millions, I'm sure, really, of women went into the armament production business. You know, Rosie the Riveter, I'm sure you've heard of women who stepped into jobs women had almost never held before in construction during World War II. And so the economy is booming with plenty of people making paychecks and spending their money. And that's what happens in a major war. Economies thrive. It's a sad but true statement that terrible wars make for good economies. But we have something else to consider, and that is the outcome of the war when the war is over and Johnny comes marching home. What happens when those millions of guys are leaving the armed forces? And I have to remind you, we demobilized. That's what you call it. We demobilized with enormous speed, spectacular speed. A year after the shooting has stopped, they're crushing bomber planes by the thousands every month, turning them into scrap metal. And all those men who are in the armed forces, the vast majority were demobilized and sent home to look for civilian work. Now, this is going to throw a lot of those women out of work. Now, some of them will leave voluntarily. A lot of them really wanted to get married and stay home and be homemakers and raise a family. They were only working because the men were gone. But there were others who were very upset about losing jobs they really liked and really enjoyed making money on their own. So there was a mixed bag for these women. Some were just delighted to be able to go back home and settle down and raise a family. Others really resented that men came home and took their jobs. But on the other hand, these guys had risked their lives for our country. And hardly anybody could really begrudge them getting their old jobs back or jobs like ones they'd had. There was a huge upswell of desire to help the vets to thrive once they got home. But it takes a while from the demobilization till the economy to pick back up. There's always about a year and a half of recession as the government turns off the money faucet. No more weapons being bought. Employment drops. Unemployment rises. And all those guys coming out of the military, a lot of them are unemployed for a period of time. So right after the war, we had a recession at the end of World War II in 1945. But by 1947, those days are past. Now, part of the reason they were past is we realized pretty quickly the Soviet Union was going to be a new adversary. We weren't going to be able to completely demobilize our military. We were going to have to build it back up. Not quite to World War II levels then, but much more than our old peacetime standards had been. So defense spending did in fact go back up in the late 40s and continued to climb during the 50s, right on up through the 80s. Defense spending for the Cold War continued to go up and up and up. And that stimulates an economy. All right, it does. Spending on bombs stimulates an economy. It's how it is. So by the late 40s, America's economy is really starting to boom. One of the reasons for that was the rise of the suburbs. Levittown, New York, then Levittown, Pennsylvania. These were suburbs made out of prefabricated housing. The Levitt brothers realized that these men coming home were going to want homes of their own. And there hadn't been any housing built during World War II. All the construction was going on for the war. No private housing had been built for 4 years. These guys are coming home and they're getting married, and 9 months later the babies start coming, and they want homes for their families. And the Levitt brothers were the first, and they set off a wave of building individuals' family homes in the suburbs. The suburbs began to explode in the late 40s and the 1950s. The house I'm sitting in right now, built in 1955, bought by my parents then, is part of that wave of suburbanism washing over every metropolitan area in America. As the GIs came home, got married, had kids in the baby boom, and wanted to settle down. And I imagine you've all heard the term baby boom. This refers to 1947, late 46 and on, when large numbers of children were born as the GIs came home, and 4 or 5 kids in a family back in those days wasn't uncommon. Right through the early 60s, the birth rate was quite high. Things will happen in the early 60s to begin to change that, and we'll talk about those. But generally, Americans born between 1945 and 1964 are called baby boomers because of this era when there were lots and lots of children being born in a very prosperous America. All right, so those are some of the base settings to keep in mind. Another reason the economy boomed was the investment in these veterans. The GI Bill was passed. And these were benefits for people who had served in the armed forces. Talking about those suburbs, one of the chief benefits was low interest loans from the government, from the VA, Veterans Administration, to be able to buy these homes. Low interest loans for all vets. And so the suburbs were partly built selling to veterans with these low interest loans. Also, America's educational system mushroomed. Not only will there in the next 2 decades be an enormous number of elementary schools and middle schools and high schools built for all those kids that are coming in the baby boom, but colleges double in size of their student bodies in just a few years. The GI Bill gave money to veterans for college or technical school or trade school. You could get money from the government to pick up the majority of your educational expenses if you wanted to extend your education beyond high school. And so this caused an enormous rise in universities. The size of increases, some of the shift in focus. A lot of our colleges have been liberal arts colleges before the war, but after the war you have a huge increase in engineering schools, in business schools, people wanting to learn practical commercial skills in colleges and universities. That hadn't been nearly as important a focus of higher education until after World War II. But these things helped to supercharge the American economy. Now, the American economy also was supercharged because we were the only ones in the game. Europe had been destroyed for 6 years. Look at Berlin in 1945. It is just a ruin. Think about the 30 million Soviet citizens killed. Every city in the far west of Russia, in the European part of Russia, up to the gates of Moscow, had been burned to a crisp by the Nazis. Russia may be a major military power, but as an economic power, it was a basket case. It took it 20, 30 years to even get back to where it was in 1940 economically. France, Italy, even Britain had been bombed so badly that 40% of the British population in 1945 was living in temporary housing because the cities had been so shellacked by German bombing that you can see that none of those economic competitors in the United States, and forget Japan, we had laid it waste with firebombing of its cities. So the major competitors of the United States economically before World War II are in poor shape to disastrously bad shape after World War II. We, on the other hand, we had one territory, two territories, Hawaii and the Philippines. Those were not, Hawaii was not a state then, remember. It becomes a state in 1959. But essentially, the United States of America proper was untouched. Trivial things the Japanese did to damage a few things. They sent some balloons over with bombs in them that could start fires, hoping to catch start forest fires in the West. And a couple of those did burn some pretty serious acreage, but only like 2 people were ever hurt by them, killed by them. So, we were unscathed. In fact, our factories had been tooled up to produce war materials, and they quickly pivoted to consumer goods after the war. In 1950, 2/3 of the manufactured goods made on planet Earth were made in the United States of America. 2/3 of the manufactured goods. The overwhelming majority of automobiles made in the world, made in the United States in the 1950s. Overwhelming majority. The whole world for years had to come to America to buy its goods. And this supercharged the American economy. We became the dominant power in the free world economically, in addition to having by far the largest military in the non-communist world. So America could really throw its weight around in those days. The 1950s, I don't know if, for your generation, if you've seen as many films set in the 1950s, as many TV shows. When I was your age, the 50s, were 25 years in the past. They were only a generation in the past. And so a lot of middle-aged people wanted to see shows set in their youth. So there were lots of them on the TV back when I was in the 70s and 80s when I was young. But the 50s was a time of material culture, consumer culture. You have the rise of the franchised fast food chains. I think 1947 would see the founding of McDonald's. Most of the major fast food chains you can think of got their start in the late 40s. Whataburger, I know, is a late 40s chain. And in the 50s, they began to blossom. And part of that is because people are on the road. I'm going to save it for a future lecture. But the interstate highway system will begin to be built in the 1950s, in the mid-1950s. And people will be able to travel by automobile, and goods will be able to travel by truck all over the United States quickly and efficiently and safely. And this was a major change. So you have the rise of a car culture where every family had a car, and increasingly families had 2 cars. 1950s are when you see that. I think in our next lecture I'll find some good visuals for you and play them for you or show them to you so we can get a feel for the 1950s a little better. But I think we'll stop there with this lecture. Hope you have a great weekend. God bless.